it's a really difficult process for a writer to figure out voice, because it almost doesn't have anything to do with writing in some ways, because you have to come from a place of basically self-help.
Yeah.
You have to dig down and just really start asking questions like, who am I? What do I believe? What's my perspective? What did I experience as a younger person? Like I have my writers go through a little journaling exercise right off the top, called, I call them voice pressure points, just looking back in their past of moments in their lives that were either positive or negative that changed their perspective on something. And their life kind of went in a different direction, whether it was big or small or whatever. They just kind of had a realization. And then how did you react to it? Because I remember interviewing two writers that wrote on Bob's Burgers, and one of them was a twin. And I asked him about voice. And he said, it's really interesting because I grew up with the twin. We had the same exact experiences growing up, almost literally at the same time. My parents fought all the time, not to the point of like horrible abuse or anything, but it was a lot. And I just took it in a way that was kind of ridiculous. And I rolled my eyes, shrugged my shoulders, kind of laughed at it. He became a comedy writer. His brother took it very hard, and he saw it in a very dramatic way, in a depressing way. And this is just, there wasn't a choice there. That's just how they took it. So I think everybody watching and listening to this, you have to kind of dig in and like, how do I react to things? And if there is commentary, what's my commentary? What's my personality? Because that then is going to be fitting within the script that you're writing. But what you make as a point is a great point, because some scripts don't need your particular voice and commentary. So that then means this isn't the right script for me to be working on. Or you change it up and you make it so it is, if it's your own. But if you're hired to write something, I mean, that's a very intuitive thing that you did, Shannan. I mean, you just know yourself better than some other people do.
You have to, but that goes back to what you said, like knowing your personality. I think your voice is you. It's literal. That's why it can't be taught. You're the only person that knows you. You're the only person that knows your voice. It's the reason why we say there are no new ideas. It's just about execution. Your voice on someone else's idea is going to be different, or at least it should be, right? Because it's what you're bringing to the table. It's the thing that makes you a writer in the first place. We can teach structure, we can teach format, we can teach you how to come up with ideas, but how it gets out on the page and what that feels like, that's you as a living, breathing being.
Right. All right. Well, I mean, we could have a whole discussion on voice and, sit everybody down in a therapist couch and what's making you tick. I mean, we need to do that. You have to do that on your own. But let's just shift gears. This is a pretty terrible segue, but we'll get into something much more basic and story centric. And the reason I want to bring it up is because, in a lot of the classes I teach, I'm sure a lot of the work that you're doing with your writers, we're always preaching character, emotion, evolution of relationships and how it always drives the story. And it does, I'm not taking that away at all, but plot, like poor plot, like it kind of has like this bad word associated with it. So let's just kind of talk about that, because I've had a few writers who I don't think they've broken it down enough to really understand what it is. And as far as I'm concerned, it's basically just a situation that a character experiences. And, I had a writer what's really sparked this a couple of weeks ago is one of my writers referenced Lady Bird as a non-plot movie. And I was like, all right, so non-plot, like I've never heard that term. And I kind of, just broke it down in my head and I'm like, I don't think that exists. I don't think there is a non-plot story. So talk about plot a little bit. Just what is it in a very general sense? Because I think most people listening and watching should at least just get this feeling of what it is.
Yeah, for me, it's literally the physical stuff that we're watching them do. It's the thing that they get into, the thing that they're trying to get out of and go through and move through, and how they get out of that. I think when someone says non-plot, what they mean is it's probably a character-driven story versus something that's more procedural, which is going to have a more static kind of plot to it. But the only reason those characters are being driven is because they're doing something and they're changing every time they do something. And that thing is now changing them emotionally and making them act or react. right? But non-plot would be what we're doing right now, which is just sitting and staring. And that's not a movie. No one wants to watch that. That's
Right.
not fun at all. So even though it might not be that the character has this external goal that has all of these natural kind of steps to get towards it, which is the thing that I teach. That's how I teach plot. I say, what is that external thing? Whatever it is that's internal, you have to externalize it, because we need something to track. We have to track the progress, and you can't track grief. So even though it may be that the character wants to get over grief, that character has decided the way that I get over grief is if I get this job at McDonald's. I don't know why that's what they've decided, but that's what they've decided. So that's the thing that we're tracking. Is this thing really about working at McDonald's? No, it's about grief. However, I can't just watch an entire movie of them sitting in their room crying, and then one day they don't cry. Yeah. I have to know, what have they been doing to get to the place of having no grief, even if that means going around and meeting family members or whatever it is that they're doing, but they're physically doing something, and that's kind of what makes up your plot and the complications that come along the way as they're doing that thing.
Right. And that it reminds me of Seinfeld, because Seinfeld, of course, was made famous for a show about nothing, but it wasn't a show about nothing. Nothing is something. Mm-hmm. And so there's a really famous moment in Seinfeld where Jerry early on asks Elaine, so what did you do today? And she said, nothing. He's like, no, I know you did nothing, but what did you actually do? And she said, no, literally, I sat in a chair and stared. And he said, wow, that's really nothing. Yeah. But even that, you could argue, is actually something from a context of that episode and show. But anyway, I'm going off on a little bit of a tangent there. But what's interesting about Lady Bird, not that we need to break Lady Bird down, I don't need to get into a discussion about it, but it is interesting to look at how the character, and this happens in a lot of stories, especially character-driven stories, most, if not all, that they start off not realizing they need something, and they're just going after what they want. And so Lady Bird, in a way, didn't really know what she wanted. She kind of had a sense of, I want freedom, but what does that look like? And so then the writers just basically said, well, let's just put her into some situations that they don't work out. Yeah. And it was just one horrible little, so it's just a character-driven story that was in multiple situations, but the overall situation is the fact that she had an overbearing mom and parents that just didn't blah, 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 you know. So that idea of non-plot is really just another term of character-driven story, like you're saying. But let's look at really plot-heavy movies even. Like what's in really, when we're talking about plot heavy, it's really high concept is another term for it. Low concept is a Lady Bird type of thing. What are some of your favorite high concept big movies?
Independence Day.
Okay.
And that's because it's very clear. Get rid of the aliens.
Get rid of the aliens, but what does Will Smith want to do?
What does he want to do?
Like a personal level.
So he wants to be what I don't remember if it wasn't an astronaut. He wanted to be in the, because he's a police officer, or is he in the military already? Yeah. And there's something that he keeps applying for every year, but he doesn't get in. Right. And then because he does this thing, he ends up doing that anyway, the thing that he can't get into. But I don't think it was NASA, but whatever it was, oh man, I keep applying for this and they won't let me in. But then he ends up kind of being in it anyway by completing this mission. But even that is still character driven in a way. Because everything is, I think they're always intertwined. Only because the character needs something, do they need to be doing something so they can reach that thing. Right. You know, and only because as they're going along their way and running into these complications, therefore emotionally changing, do they arc or not arc? So they're all contingent upon each other for me. I mean, obviously sometimes if it's character driven, then there's a little less plot. And if it's more plot driven, then there's more plot, but they're both, they're necessary for each other. Yeah. Even if, because writers they're really good at bringing up examples like, well, what about this movie? Or, well, they did that. And it's, I always try to say, we can't compare your story to others. It's like, if you're a painter and you look at Monet and you're like, well, I have to do it like Monet did. And no, you don't. It's Monet, maybe that's an exaggerated example, but no, I understand, because at the end of the day, there's an audience for everything. It's your screenplay. Do what you want to do. who knows if it's going to end up being a hit or a flop? We don't know. And so who knows when those screenplays were in development, if someone said, we need a little more of this or a little less of this. We haven't the slightest idea, but there's an audience for everything. There's plenty of stuff on television and in theaters right now that each of us subjectively would think that's a terrible movie or that's a terrible television show, or how did that thing get made? I would never do it, right? So a lot of people just don't want to follow the rules, but you have to know what the rules are before you break them so that you can understand what you're breaking. So when you're in those rooms with those development executives and they're saying more plot or less plot or more character driven stuff, more emotion, whatever it is they're saying, that you can then explain to them how your story is pushing forward. Because what usually happens with clients who say, well, this is a character driven story, the story isn't pushing forward because they don't understand the difference between plot in a procedural way and plot as in your character needs to be actively moving forward so that we can track their progress of whether it's the internal goal or the external goal. There's something to track. But if they're just kind of hanging out, doing absolutely nothing intentional, then we don't have a story. And so I think it just kind of falls in that place where they want to say, well, what about this movie or that movie? And it's like, well, we can break down every single movie in life. But if you're getting the note that your character is inactive and not doing anything, then that's what we need to focus on, you know?
Right. Yeah. I mean, there are plenty of movies where the character doesn't change, or there's a tiny little change at the end. Forrest Gump, he doesn't really change, but he changes everybody around him.
Yes.
Even the audience is supposed to believe, oh, he created all these things just out of random coincidence. That's the whole point. Like, that's why the movie was made. And so if you do have a character that doesn't change, you better have a reason for it. You have to know why I don't want this character to change. Or it's a requiem for a dream and it ends so badly, but then there's a thematic reason for that. It's so you don't freaking do drugs. Like there's a statement to be made, you know? So anyway, like you said, we could break down a ton of movies. But to switch then to a little, because I totally agree. Like plot and character are completely intertwined. And the trouble that I find some writers have is the early development process where, you know, because every writer is different, every story is different. Sometimes you come up with the setup first. Sometimes you come up with just a basic situation. Aliens come down and abduct my daughter, you know, like, okay, what happened, you know, but then you have to instill character within that. Who's the best character for the audience to learn something to put into the situation? And so from a character, how does character development and the emotional side of the story then differ, like just to try to help explain it to the writers watching, how does it differ? The character development versus plot development and how to develop that, like literally the brainstorming process.
Yeah, for me, character development is everything because like you said, you have to find the best character for this plot, right? You have to find a character that is the best person to try to reach that goal or accomplish, you know, reach that goal or solve that problem. And not every character is the best person for the job. So you have to do the work of figuring out who these people are. In my classes, I teach from trauma, which I know sounds really sad, but we are all people who have dealt with trauma, big or small, and it creates that hole inside of us, which is that internal need. And the only reason my external goal exists is because I'm trying to fill this thing, which is why if I don't reach my goal or solve the problem, but I fill this hole, then the audience is still going to feel satisfied with the end, even if I wasn't victorious. And so for me, it's about really figuring out, no matter what genre it is, the impact comes in that emotional thing, because that's what makes us all relatable, right? And even if it is a character who doesn't know they have a hole, right? Like you think of like Uncut Gems, which is crazy and drives a lot of people's anxiety through the roof. He doesn't change at all, right? But at the same time, we understand that there's something going on there that's making him have to gamble and spend his money and making him self-destruct. There's something that's happening there and he wants to fix it. He just can't. He doesn't have the ability to, but he's actively trying. He just keeps getting pushed back. So I think, you know, that character development is a big thing. So I always ask people, well, why would that character do it? I give people the example of come from a family with at least 2 or 3 siblings, and you were all put in one room and given one problem. Would all 3 of you try to solve it the same way? No.
I bet there would be one that just says, I quit.
Yeah. Or there'd be the one, maybe it's the baby of the family, or maybe the middle child who's just like, you guys figure it out. Like, I don't have to,
Right.
I don't have to do the thinking. I don't have to do the, so with that being said, we're all individual people who are bringing unique situations to the things that we do. And the only reason we do them is because of who we are. As a Black woman, I am going to make decisions that may be different from other people because of my experience. As an immigrant, I'm going to make a decision because of my experience. So the same thing with that young man that came up to you. He had that question because of his experience. Now, I'm not saying that that means that everything that your character is going through is going to be about race or gender. It could be about where they're from. It could be about how they're raised. It could be about them being in a boating accident where they were little and now they won't ever go towards the water. But guess what? It's happening in this story, water. So now you're putting your character in the hot seat to have to deal with that thing and therefore close up that hole, which is why that emotional through line matters so much. I have to be able to follow the character emotionally so that I can know that this thing is getting closer to being closed, or that they're pulling it and it's a gaping wound now because of whatever it is they've been going through. And now I'm totally invested. It doesn't matter if it's a horror film, doesn't matter if it's a thriller, doesn't matter if it's a comedy. I'm totally invested because I understand what they have going on, even if they don't. If it's a horror film and I'm not invested, then just die. You know, I don't care if the monster gets you, like they can get you 5 minutes in. I don't care because I don't care about you and you didn't seem to have anything going for yourself anyway. So end of movie.
And we as the audience need to see that. I use the example of 40-year-old and see it literally, like show it to us, you know. But I use the example 40-year-old virgin all the time, probably so much that people watching are sick of hearing me talk about it. But it's such a simple movie. The plot itself is literally in the title. It's just an easy one to see as an example. Most people know about it or have seen it. But what is so special about that movie is that his problem is really not that big of a deal. Like in the universal level of that problem, not a big deal. But what we see is that for him, it's everything.
It's everything.
And so we buy it. We're like, all right, this poor guy, he's in a sex talk group. And he's asking, is it true that if you don't use it, you lose it? And the way he says it, he's really genuine. And we're like, oh God, this guy. And so we see that within like the first 20 minutes. So we're in. And so whatever, and Jen Grisandi is a consultant, and she literally calls it the wound. What's your character's wound? And so you have to know that. So all of this character development needs to be done well before you start plotting things out, the structure and the beats. The structure doesn't really matter if you don't understand who these characters are. What situation am I going to put them in? You know,
and why they make decisions. Because sometimes I will literally ask the question: the character that you set up would not make this decision. Why are they doing it? And then my comment is usually because you, as the writer, need them to do it, not because they would naturally. You have to put the character in a position where he or she would naturally make these decisions and they don't feel forced by your hand. But that's only if you've done the work to know that they're the right character for this story in the first place, you know?
Yeah. And so that just means you have to know your characters inside and out, you know? I mean, the J.K. Rowling is famous for this. I think she had a room full of huge boxes of just character sketches of so many characters. She knew everything about these characters before she ever wrote the book. So, you know, it's a tall ladder to climb. You got work to do. Let's hit another little topic and question. We do have a decent chunk of questions down there, and we'll hit them. We're coming up almost on the hour mark, so we got time. So what do you find yourself discussing more often than not with your consulting clients? And it could be anything, formatting to concept.
Well, definitely formatting, because I have a lot of newbies. And my only answer to that is that you have to read a lot of screenplays. You know, and I also tell people buy Final Draft, because then it'll at least get you halfway there. You got to know which buttons to push, but you know, it'll at least get you halfway there. But a lot of my, you know, conversation is about formatting, because you could have a great script, but if I can't read it, then now you're giving an executive an excuse to go, and then also realizing, consultants exist because we are the teachers, we are the educators, right? Everybody else in the industry is not here to educate you. So they're not going to take the time to say, you know what, this is a great script, but all of the formatting issues, because what they're going to think is, and now every time you send me a draft, there's going to be a formatting issue. And I don't have time to teach you and get you to the level that you need to be. So I spend a lot of time talking about formatting, just because, again, you don't want that to be the reason people choose not to read. The other thing is what we just said, it's about that emotional thing. And I'm not personally an emotional kind of girl. But when I read a screenplay, if you want me to be invested, I got to know how these people are feeling about things, and how, because of what they're feeling, they're choosing to act or react in the way that they do, which eventually takes them to their climax. So I'm always kind of asking that question, or saying, you need to follow the emotional through line. How did we get here? What made them change their mind about something? Another one that I give all the time is scene work, and how the scenes aren't pushing the story forward. And so, sure, there was a scene and these people talk to each other, but I didn't learn anything new. I didn't learn anything that changes that character. When a character enters a scene, they should not exit the scene being the same person, right? They've been changed either emotionally or the plot has changed. And if they've been changed emotionally, they're going to act or react, so the plot will change anyway. So, again, it's, they intersect with each other.
I call that technically the Back to the Future effect, because if you watch Back to the Future, it's so every single scene is a new complication and twist. There's a new problem. And obviously it's a high concept, big movie, and it's supposed to be fun and adventurous. So it doesn't always have to be that exaggerated, but it's a great example to see. Yeah. Every single scene, and from the literal first scene, we see him plug in his guitar, he's going to strum it, and then he gets blown back and he blows there's a little problem.
Yeah.
So I totally agree.
Oftentimes people will say, well, what about this scene? What about this scene? And then I give the same answer, that just because it got made does not mean it was structurally sound. It could mean they just knew something and they got their screenplay made. However, I've been doing workshops lately where we've been breaking down movies and pilots scene by scene. What did we just learn in this scene? How does it push the story forward? And so far, I think I've done 2 or 3 of these, and there hasn't been one scene yet where people have said, we learned absolutely nothing, there was no new information, and the characters were not changed.
What were the movies?
Though we watched Set It Off, we watched Brothers and Sisters, and then I can't remember the third thing that I've watched. But as a regular viewer, they had missed what was happening in those scenes. But I'm like, well, now you're a screenwriter, so you got to go back and ask yourself, what did you learn in this scene, and how does it push the story forward? And again, remembering that pushing the story forward doesn't necessarily mean plot. It may mean emotion, but then check off your list or make yourself a column and say, so it changed them emotional here. How did that change in emotion then affect something later? Because for example, if I come into the house and have an argument with my husband, and then I go into the next room and I'm at a party and I'm having a great time and nothing is bothering me, I'm going to ask why I needed to see the fight with the husband. If I have that fight with my husband and then I go in here and it's obvious that the tension is there and I'm trying to act as if I'm having a good time, but because I'm not, I then mess up something that I needed to do, or it affects in some kind of way. Now I know why we needed the fight with the husband, because the energy is carried through the next scene. The emotion is carried through the next scene. Right.
Everything is connected. And then I'm totally jumping to formatting for a second, but I see it a lot, the usage of continuous in the scene heading. Yeah. And the proper way is a literal production element, that it's a continuous shot. There's no cut in the camera. You're moving from living room to dining room, and we're following this person in. It's very basic approach. But you could argue that a whole script is continuous. Like some writers want, well, I want this to happen right after the scene. And I'm like, well, it is. You've got a new scene ending. Yeah. But what you're saying is dead on, because everything after we experience a scene, we as the reader or the audience, it's impossible for us to not
let it go. Yeah.
So it has to drag into that new scene. So even if you have multiple storylines in a TV series or something, and you go from Walt and Breaking Bad, and then you go to Jesse, we're still feeling the Walt thing. And now we've got to deal with Jesse. And it's one reason why Breaking Bad was so amazing, because it was just constant of, oh my Lord, what else is going to happen? And they had these amazing storylines.
Right. And so then purposefully leaving Walt and going to Jesse. It's intentional, because whatever tension you have here, they want you to be feeling while you're listening to this next thing. Nothing's happenstance. They could have gone to any other scene after that, but they chose to go that way because they want you to take something from here, take it there, live with it until you get back to Walt and get whatever new information you're going to get.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. Okay. Let's see. Let's do a couple more questions here, and then we'll dive into the Q&A. So different subject, but I get this question a lot. And because of the whole pandemic situation we have going on, do writers who are not living in Los Angeles have a better chance now at getting attention?
I definitely think so, because people are doing what they have to do. I read something earlier this week, maybe last week, that said, because of the pandemic, there weren't a lot of spec scripts that were purchased, period. So I think also because our industry is heavy risk, but they don't like to take risk, a lot of people kind of went into their circles of, okay, well, let me go with what I know instead of opening up to new people. However, a lot of people ended up getting management of some kind, agents of some kind. There were a few people who did not live in Los Angeles who got booked on writing staffs. So definitely take advantage. The biggest advantage is that because everybody was doing absolutely nothing for a while, those people who usually weren't open to reading your stuff were suddenly open to reading your stuff. And the Twitterverse really helped to circulate a lot of people's screenplays. There's a huge, if you're not on Twitter, guys, there's a huge writing community on Twitter, and they were circulating people's things all over the place. One of my clients actually, her writing staff job on Twitter with her spec. So it's definitely possible. Now, how long it'll stay that way, I don't know, because from what I hear from writers, they don't like Zoom rooms. They don't like them, mostly because of the energy, right? Yeah. Being on a writing staff is very intimate, and being able to exchange those ideas and be in the same room with people and being there all day and all night. But when you're on Zoom, you kind of get tired, and the showrunners feel like, okay, we have, let's just go.
And there's that, it's difficult to talk over people. And in a writing room, you're like, you have to kind of let one person talk at a time, and it messes up the energy. Yeah.
And especially if you're new to the room and you don't know how to get in, and you're not able to feel that energy. And so I heard one showrunner say that they won't be hiring any new staff writers while they're on Zoom because it's too hard to incorporate them into the family. And then they end up feeling alienated. And then they have a negative first year of being on a writing staff. So I think for LA, as soon as they can get back into being in rooms with each other, they will.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. And I think it's going to go back to basically the way it was. If you want to write on a show, you have to be in LA. They might have a couple staffs in New York, but it's pretty much LA centric. If you want to be writing on, if you want to be staff, it is possible to sell a pilot or get a pilot set up if you're not going to be on staff, but then it's kind of like, I don't know why you'd want that. Why not be staffed? But the feature market has always kind of been, if you write a great movie, somebody's going to pick it up, and they don't really care where you're from.
They don't care. What I usually tell feature people is, it's still a good idea to be here for a little bit, if for no other reason, for the networking. If you're brand new, or if you do get if you get a manager, an agent, they're going to be sending you out on a lot of meetings and a lot of generals. And sure, maybe after the pandemic, the industry will be okay with doing Zoom meetings or doing phone calls. But before now, those meetings were in person. And because LA is LA, those meetings often get canceled and rescheduled. So how often are you going to be able to get on a plane and come back and forth and back and forth and back and forth until you've established yourself enough to just submit your screenplay via email, Yeah. So even though as a feature writer, you don't have to live here, I still always say, if you can, come on out for a little while, for a couple of years, just to get your bearings and get set up so people can see you. Because again, this is an energy kind of place. It's a who you know kind of place. So people want to be in the room with you if they're going to be working you. And then once you get established, then you can go where you want. But as a TV writer, this is where the industry is. It's kind of like saying that you want to be an astronaut, but you don't want to leave Michigan. You got to go to where NASA is.
Right. Yeah. Unless you build your own spaceship, but then I don't recommend trying that. All right. Last question. I asked this of all the guests that I have on panels and podcasts. What's the worst advice you ever received? And it could be non-entertainment related, whatever the worst advice that you've ever had.
That's the one. When I read that question, I was like, I don't know. What is the worst advice I've ever received? I don't know. What I will say is, as a young person, I received the same advice that I give people now, and I didn't want to listen to it then. But, it was the whole pick a lane thing. And as a young person who is a creative, and most of us who are creatives are multi-hyphenates, I kept hearing someone crushing my dreams and saying that I can't do it all and no one's that talented. So of course, as a 22-year-old, it was like, what? Of course I'm talented. I can do everything, right? But what I matured into understanding was, people want you to be an expert at your thing. They don't want you to be a master of none. And so in order to do that, you have to focus. It doesn't mean that you can't ever hop into the other lanes that you have, but you have to be able to prove yourself in one of those lanes and then utilize whatever, steam you've garnered to say, hey, I also have these other things going on. But oftentimes, not oftentimes, let's just put it this way. Our industry is segregated in that way. We have TV managers, TV agents, feature agents, we have development execs, we have current execs. And so they don't necessarily cross-pollinate in that way. So they need to know what they're selling, which is you. So if you come into the room and say, well, I'm a this, and this, that says to them, you aren't focused. I can't sell that when I go into another room. So you have to be able to come in and say, I am a TV writer who writes this particular thing. And now I can go into another room and I can pitch that and I can get you booked on a staff. So it took me some time to understand that. And now it's the same thing that I say to people all the time. And I kind of get their same response that I had when I was 22. But I think it's, it's really good advice. Just focus and get really good at that thing. Become an expert in that thing. Because when you're an expert, people will listen to you, in all the rest of the areas that you're creative in.
And it doesn't necessarily mean that if you want to write romantic comedies, you're never going to be able to write a horror movie. It's just pick at your first lane, exactly. and eventually you can break out. It's like running, I ran track in high school. And so you would start out on a 400-meter dash, each in your own lane. Eventually you come and move into one. This is the metaphor. This is how my brain works. Anyway, anything else before we dive into Q&A that you wanted to either plug, or any pieces of advice or anything that we didn't really cover?
Let's see. I think I mentioned everything. I'm on Instagram at The Professional Pen. I don't think I have any other workshops coming up, except for, yes, I do have something in March. And of course, I can't think of what day it is, but I'll be putting it up next week. And we're going to talk about how the F do I introduce my protagonist? So how you can get us to relate to your protagonist instantly in a unique and interesting way, so that we'll want to journey with them through the rest of the time.
That's great.
So I think that's the next thing that I have coming up. Everything else is kind of a jumble. So just follow me, guys. I always post about it. That's how I keep my own self on track, is I know I post.